In the sprawling territory of Wyoming, where the land stretched endlessly beneath a canvas of deepening twilight, the horizon seemed to swallow the world whole. Samuel Sam Mackenzie, a grizzled cattleman whose face bore the lines of 35 hard summers and bitter winters, guided his bay mare along the familiar path that wound toward his modest ranch. The leather of his saddle creaked rhythmically with each step, a sound that had become as natural to him as his own breathing. The day had begun before dawn, as they always did. Sam had ridden the northern pastures, checking on a herd of longhorns that grazed near Willow Creek, mending a section of fence damaged by a recent thunderstorm, and replacing a broken water trough that his cattle depended upon. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of rope burns and barbed wire cuts, ached with the familiar pain of honest labor. Yet despite the physical exhaustion that pulled at his bones, his mind remained alert, always watching, always listening. The evening air carried the sweet scent of wild sage and the distant promise of rain. Thunder clouds gathered on the western horizon, their dark bellies pregnant with moisture that the parched land desperately needed. Sam's mare, Rosie, picked her way carefully along the rocky trail, her hooves finding purchase on loose stone and hardpan earth. The only sounds were the soft thud of her steps, the gentle jingle of his spurs, and the occasional call of a meadowlark from the grasslands below. It should have been a peaceful end to another long day, but something nagged at the edges of Sam's consciousness. His instincts, honed by years of living alone in country where danger could come from any direction, rustlers, wild animals, or worse, told him that all was not right. The cattle in the distance seemed restless, their low calls carrying an unusual urgency. Even the horses in his small remuda, visible as dark shapes against the pale grass, stood with their heads raised, ears pricked forward in alert attention. Then he saw it, a thin tendril of smoke rising from the cottonwood grove near Willow Creek, perhaps 2 miles distant. In this vast emptiness, smoke meant only a few things, and none of them were good. It could be a campfire of drifters passing through, though most travelers kept to the main roads. It could be lightning-struck timber smoldering from the afternoon's distant storm, or it could be something far worse, raiders, claim jumpers, or the kind of desperate men who made their living preying upon isolated ranchers. Sam's jaw tightened as he considered his options. The sensible thing would be to ride straight home, bar his door, and load his rifle. But something about that smoke troubled him more than usual. It was too small, too controlled to be a wildfire, yet too isolated to be a normal traveler's camp. Against his better judgment, he turned Rosie toward the distant grove. The ride across the open grassland took nearly an hour, the sun sinking lower with each passing minute until the sky blazed with shades of gold and crimson. As Sam drew closer to the source of the smoke, other details became clear. The acrid smell of burned wood mixed with something else, something that made his stomach clench with foreboding. There was the metallic scent of blood in the air, and beneath that, the sickly, sweet smell of death. Sam slowed Rosie to a walk as they approached the cottonwood grove. His right hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 holstered at his hip, thumb resting on the hammer. Years of living on the frontier had taught him that caution kept a man alive, while curiosity often buried him. The grove was eerily quiet. No birds sang in the branches overhead, and even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. The smoke rose from the smoldering remains of what had once been a small camp. Blankets and personal belongings scattered and burned, cooking utensils trampled into the soft earth near the creek. But it was what lay beyond the ruined campsite that made Sam's blood run cold. Bodies. 3 of them, sprawled in the unnatural poses of violent death. 2 were men, their buckskin clothing and long braided hair marking them as members of one of the local tribes. The 3rd was an older woman, her traditional dress torn and blood-stained. All 3 had been shot, probably at close range, judging by the powder burns visible on their clothing. Sam dismounted slowly, his boots making no sound on the soft grass. He had seen death before, too many times, but the deliberate cruelty of what had happened here made his hands shake with suppressed anger. This wasn't the result of a fight, or even a raid. This was murder, plain and simple, the kind of senseless killing that gave all white men a bad name among the tribal peoples. As he moved through the scene, trying to piece together what had happened, a soft sound reached his ears. So faint he might have imagined it. A whisper of breath, a barely audible whimper of pain. Sam froze, listening intently. There it was again, coming from a cluster of willows near the water's edge. Moving carefully, his hand still resting on his gun, Sam pushed through the drooping branches. What he found there nearly stopped his heart. A young woman, probably no more than 18 or 19 years old, lay partially hidden beneath the trailing willow fronds. Her traditional dress, beautifully beaded and fringed, was torn and soaked with blood. 2 arrows protruded from her left side, just below her ribs, and a third had grazed her right shoulder, leaving a deep, angry wound. But she was alive. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths, and her eyes, dark as midnight and filled with pain, flickered open when she sensed his presence. For a moment they stared at each other across a gulf of language and culture, predator and prey, white man and Indian, everything that should have made them enemies. But all Sam could see was a young woman dying alone while the buzzards circled overhead. She tried to speak, her voice barely a whisper in her native tongue. Sam couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. She was asking for help, or perhaps preparing to die, or maybe warning him of some danger he hadn't yet seen. Her hand moved weakly toward one of the arrows, and Sam caught her wrist gently. "Easy there, miss," he said softly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Don't try to move. Those arrows need to stay put until I can get you somewhere safe." She probably couldn't understand his words any more than he could understand hers, but something in his tone seemed to calm her. Her struggles ceased, and she watched him with those dark eyes as he examined her wounds more carefully. The arrows were crude but effective, probably shot from close range. The one in her side had penetrated deeply, but it seemed to have missed her vital organs. The shoulder wound was more superficial, though it had bled heavily. What worried Sam most was her color, the pallor of her skin and the way her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that spoke of significant blood loss. Sam had treated wounded cattle, horses, and even men before. Living alone on the frontier meant learning to be your own doctor, veterinarian, and undertaker. But this was different. This was a young woman from a people who had every reason to distrust white men, dying from wounds inflicted by someone who looked like him. Yet the choice, when it came down to it, was no choice at all. He couldn't leave her here to die, any more than he could have ridden past a wounded animal without trying to help. It went against everything he believed about right and wrong, about what it meant to be a man in a hard country. "I'm going to help you," he said, as much to convince himself as to comfort her. "I don't know if your people will understand, and I don't know if I'll live to regret it. But I can't leave you here." Working as carefully as he could, Sam broke off the protruding shafts of the arrows, leaving the points embedded in her flesh. Moving them would only cause more damage and bleeding. He used strips torn from his own shirt to bind the wounds as best he could, then fashioned a makeshift stretcher from his bedroll and 2 sturdy willow branches. The young woman drifted in and out of consciousness as he worked, sometimes watching him with those intelligent dark eyes, other times muttering feverishly in her native language. Once, when he accidentally jarred one of her wounds, she cried out, a sound so filled with pain that it cut through him like a knife. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't understand. "I'm trying not to hurt you, but I've got to get you out of here." As gently as possible, Sam lifted her onto the improvised stretcher and secured it to his saddle. Rosie snorted nervously at the smell of blood and the unfamiliar burden, but she was a steady horse, trained to work cattle and accustomed to carrying strange loads. Sam mounted carefully, adjusting his seat to accommodate the stretcher, then began the long journey back toward his ranch. The ride through the gathering darkness was a nightmare of careful movement and constant worry. Every jolt, every stumble of his horse sent a fresh wave of pain through the injured woman. Sam found himself talking to her constantly, a low stream of reassurance and encouragement, even though he knew she probably couldn't understand a word. "Stay with me now," he murmured as they crossed a particularly rough stretch of ground. "We're going to get through this. I've got a place not too far ahead, with clean water and supplies. You just hold on a little longer." The stars came out one by one as they traveled, a brilliant canopy in the clear mountain air. Coyotes began their nightly chorus somewhere in the distance, their wild voices rising and falling in harmonies as old as the land itself. Sam's mare plodded steadily onward, her breathing becoming more labored with the extra weight and the rough terrain. Twice during the night, Sam had to stop to check on his patient. The first time, he thought he had lost her. Her breathing had become so shallow and irregular that he could barely detect it. But when he touched her forehead, her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with what might have been gratitude or might have been resignation. The second stop came when they reached Deer Creek, still several miles from his ranch. The woman was clearly in distress, her breathing rapid and her skin hot with fever. Sam knew she needed water and rest, but he also knew that every minute's delay reduced her chances of survival. He made the decision to stop for an hour, letting his horse drink and rest while he tried to get some water into the injured woman. She was barely conscious, but she managed to swallow a few sips from his canteen, and he used more water to clean her wounds and check his makeshift bandages. "You're a fighter," he told her as he worked. "I can see it in your eyes. Don't give up on me now." As if she understood his words, she seemed to rally slightly, her breathing becoming more regular, and her color improving just a little. Sam took this as a good sign and decided to push on toward his ranch. The final miles seemed to take forever. Sam's back ached from the awkward position he had to maintain to keep the stretcher balanced, and his horse was showing signs of exhaustion. But as the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the eastern sky, the familiar outline of his ranch buildings appeared on the horizon. Sam's ranch was modest by most standards, a two-room cabin built from logs he had cut and hauled himself, a small barn for his horses, and a corral for working cattle. But it represented years of backbreaking work and every dollar he had managed to save from his wages as a cowhand on other men's spreads. It was his place, his refuge, from a world that often seemed bent on grinding a man down. He rode straight to the cabin, dismounting carefully so as not to jar his injured passenger. The woman had been unconscious for the last hour of their journey, and Sam was beginning to fear the worst. But when he checked her pulse, it was still there, weak and thready, but steady. Working quickly, Sam cleared his small table and covered it with clean blankets. Then, with infinite care, he lifted the woman from the stretcher and laid her on the makeshift bed. In the growing daylight, he could see her more clearly, and what he saw both amazed and worried him. She was beautiful, even in her injured state. Her features were fine and delicate, with high cheekbones and full lips. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was braided with what appeared to be silver ornaments and eagle feathers, marks of high status among her people, if Sam's limited knowledge was correct. Her dress, too, spoke of importance. The beadwork was intricate and obviously expensive, worked in patterns that probably held deep meaning within her culture. But it was her wounds that demanded his immediate attention. The arrow in her side had shifted during the journey, and fresh blood stained the makeshift bandages. Sam knew he had to remove the arrowheads, but he also knew that doing so without proper medical supplies could kill her, as surely as leaving them in place. He had some experience with bullet wounds, too much experience, truth be told. But arrows were different. They were designed to do maximum damage, with barbed points that tore flesh when removed. Still, he had no choice but to try. Sam gathered what supplies he had: a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic, his sharpest knife, needle and thread for stitching, and clean cloth for bandages. He also built up the fire in his stone fireplace, knowing he would need hot water and good light for what lay ahead. As he prepared for the delicate operation, the woman's eyes opened. She looked around the unfamiliar cabin with obvious confusion and growing alarm, her gaze taking in the stone fireplace, the rough-hewn furniture, and finally settling on Sam himself. For a moment, he thought she might try to flee, injured as she was. "Easy," he said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. I'm going to help you, but I need to take those arrows out first." She spoke rapidly in her own language, her voice weak but urgent. Sam caught what sounded like questions, probably asking where she was, what had happened to her family, why a white man was treating her wounds. He wished desperately that he could understand, could explain that he had nothing to do with the violence that had claimed her loved ones. Instead, he could only show her through his actions. Moving slowly and carefully, he began to examine the arrow wounds, explaining what he was doing, even though she couldn't understand his words. "This one in your side is the worst," he said, gently probing around the embedded shaft. "It's deep, but I think it missed anything vital. The one in your shoulder should be easier. It's not in as far." She watched his every move with those dark, intelligent eyes, and Sam had the uncomfortable feeling that she was judging not just his medical skills, but his character as well. Her people had been betrayed by white men before. He knew that much from the stories that circulated among the settlers. She had every reason to expect the worst from him, but as he worked, cleaning her wounds with whiskey and water, his gentle touch and obvious concern seemed to reassure her somewhat. She stopped trying to speak and instead focused on controlling her breathing as he prepared to remove the first arrowhead. "This is going to hurt," Sam warned her, wishing again that she could understand. "I'm going to try to be as quick as possible." The arrow in her shoulder came out relatively easily, though it caused a fresh flow of blood that he had to stanch quickly. The woman bit her lip to keep from crying out, but tears ran down her cheeks as Sam cleaned and stitched the wound. The arrow in her side proved more difficult. It had penetrated deeply, and the barbed point had caught in the muscle. Sam had to work carefully, using his knife to enlarge the wound slightly, so he could extract the arrowhead without doing more damage. Throughout the ordeal, the woman remained conscious and alert, though Sam could see the tremendous effort it cost her. Once, when the pain became too intense, she gripped his wrist with surprising strength, her nails digging into his skin. But she didn't try to stop him, seeming to understand that this torture was necessary if she was going to survive. When it was finally over, Sam had removed both arrowheads and stitched the wounds closed. The woman had lost more blood and she was clearly exhausted, but her breathing was easier and her color seemed slightly better. Sam covered her with his best blankets and gave her water mixed with a little whiskey to help with the pain. "Rest now," he told her, smoothing the hair back from her forehead. "The worst is over." She looked at him for a long moment, and he thought he saw something like gratitude in her expression. Then her eyes closed, and she fell into what appeared to be natural sleep, rather than the unconsciousness of blood loss and shock. Sam collapsed into his chair by the fire, suddenly aware of his own exhaustion. He had been awake for nearly 40 hours, and the emotional strain of treating the wounded woman had taken its toll. But he couldn't afford to sleep yet. He needed to tend to his horse, check his cattle, and most importantly, decide what to do next. The woman was obviously a person of importance among her people. Her clothing and ornaments marked her as someone with status, possibly the daughter of a chief or medicine man. When her people came looking for her, and they would come looking, what would they think when they found her in the cabin of a white rancher? Sam knew the stories of white men who had taken Indian women, either as captives or wives. Most of those stories ended badly for everyone involved. He also knew that the local tribes were on edge lately, with more settlers moving into their traditional hunting grounds and conflicts becoming more frequent. Finding one of their women in his cabin could easily spark a war that would engulf the entire territory. But he couldn't regret his decision to help her. Looking at her peaceful face as she slept, Sam felt something he hadn't experienced in years of solitary living, a sense of connection, of purpose beyond his own survival. For the first time since his wife had died in the cholera epidemic 3 years ago, he felt responsible for another human being's welfare. The sun climbed higher as Sam went about his necessary chores. He fed and watered Rosie, who seemed none the worse for their night-long journey. He checked his small herd of cattle, counting heads and looking for signs of predators or rustlers. He replenished his water barrels from the well and gathered eggs from his few chickens. But all the while, his thoughts remained with the woman sleeping in his cabin. Every few minutes, he found excuses to check on her, listening to her breathing and watching for signs of fever or infection. She slept deeply, occasionally murmuring words in her own language that might have been prayers, or might have been the names of loved ones. It was mid-afternoon when exhaustion finally overtook him. Sam had intended to stay awake, to keep watch in case the woman took a turn for the worse, or in case her people came looking for her. But the combination of physical fatigue and emotional strain proved too much. He settled into his chair by the fire, intending to rest his eyes for just a few minutes. He awoke to the sensation of rough rope cutting into his wrists and the uncomfortable pressure of tree bark against his back. For a moment, confusion clouded his mind. He was no longer in his cabin by the warm fire, but outside in the cool morning air, bound tightly to one of the large cottonwoods that grew near his well. Panic surged through him as the memories came flooding back. The injured woman, the long night of surgery, his decision to rest for just a moment. How long had he been asleep? How had he been moved without waking? And where was the woman he had risked everything to save? Sam tested the ropes that bound him, but whoever had tied them knew their business. The knots were tight and positioned where he couldn't reach them with his fingers. His arms were already beginning to ache from being pulled behind the tree, and he could feel the bark scraping against his back through his shirt. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up. Through the trees that surrounded his cabin, he could see movement, figures emerging from the forest with the silent grace of natural hunters. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. The woman's people had found her, and they had drawn their own conclusions about his involvement in her injuries. They came into view slowly. Men dressed in traditional buckskin and armed with bows, lances, and a few rifles that had probably been acquired through trade. Their faces were painted for war, with designs in red and black that made their expressions seem even more stern and forbidding. Sam counted at least a dozen warriors, all of them focused on him with the intensity of predators evaluating their prey. But it was the man who walked at their head who commanded Sam's attention. He was tall and powerfully built, probably in his 40s, with graying hair braided with feathers and beads of rank. His face was seamed with old scars, and his eyes held the kind of hardness that came from years of warfare and loss. This was clearly a war chief, a man accustomed to making life and death decisions. The chief approached to within a few feet of Sam's tree, his dark eyes studying the bound rancher with cold calculation. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but understandable. "White man," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "You have my daughter. Where is she?" Sam's throat was dry, but he managed to find his voice. "She's safe. In my cabin. I found her wounded by Willow Creek and brought her here to help." The chief's expression didn't change, but Sam thought he saw a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, or suspicion in those dark eyes. The other warriors murmured among themselves, and Sam caught what sounded like heated discussion, though he couldn't understand the words. "You found her wounded," the chief repeated, as if testing the words for truth. "And you brought her to your lodge to help. Why?" It was a fair question, and Sam struggled to find an answer that would make sense to a man who had probably seen too much treachery from white settlers. "Because she was dying," he said simply. "Because it was the right thing to do." The chief studied him for a long moment, then barked an order in his own language. Two of the warriors trotted toward the cabin, their weapons ready. Sam's heart hammered against his ribs as he waited to learn the fate of the woman he had tried to save. Long minutes passed before the warriors emerged from the cabin, supporting the woman between them. She was awake and alert, though clearly still weak from her injuries. She had wrapped herself in one of Sam's blankets, and Sam could see the clean bandages he had applied, showing white against her dark skin. When she saw her father, for there was no doubt now about their relationship, her face lit up with joy and relief. She spoke rapidly in their shared language, gesturing toward Sam as she talked. Whatever she was saying caused a stir among the assembled warriors, and Sam saw several of them lower their weapons slightly. The chief listened to his daughter's words with the gravity of a judge hearing testimony in a capital case. His eyes never left Sam's face, as if trying to read the truth there. When she finished speaking, he asked her several questions, which she answered with what sounded like growing passion and conviction. Finally, the chief turned back to Sam. "My daughter says you took arrows from her body, that you gave her water and covered her wounds, that you spoke gently and did not touch her in the way of men who take women as captives." "That's all true," Sam confirmed, not sure if this was helping his case or condemning him further. "She also says there were others at the place where you found her. Others of our people, lying dead." Sam's stomach clenched. Here was the heart of the matter, the question that would determine whether he lived or died in the next few minutes. "Yes," he said quietly. 3 of them, a woman and 2 men. They had been shot. "And you did not kill them?" "No." The word came out stronger than Sam had expected. "I found them already dead. Whoever did it was gone by the time I arrived." The chief studied him for what felt like an eternity. The other warriors waited in tense silence, their weapons ready, their eyes fixed on their leader's face for some sign of his decision. "My daughter believes you speak truth," the chief said finally, "but belief is not proof. How do I know you did not kill my people and then take my daughter to use as you wished?" It was a reasonable question, and Sam struggled to find an answer that would satisfy a grieving father who had every reason to distrust white men. "Because if I had wanted to hurt her, I could have done it while she was unconscious and helpless," he said finally. "Because if I had killed your people, I would have killed her too, not spent the night digging arrows out of her body." The chief considered this, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then he spoke a few words to one of his warriors, who immediately began examining the ground around the cabin, looking for sign. Sam watched nervously as the warrior, clearly an expert tracker, studied the area around his well, his corral, and the path leading from the forest. The man spent particular attention on the hoofprints left by Sam's horse, following them back in the direction of Willow Creek. After several minutes, the tracker returned and spoke quietly to his chief. Whatever he reported seemed to corroborate Sam's story, because the chief's rigid posture relaxed slightly. "My scout says your horse was heavily loaded when you returned last night," the chief said. "The tracks show you came from the direction of the place where my people died. But he also says there are other tracks there. Unshod horses, many of them, traveling fast toward the north." Sam felt a surge of relief. The tracker had found evidence of the real killers, whoever they were. "I told you the truth," he said. "I had nothing to do with those deaths. I only tried to save your daughter's life." The chief looked at his daughter again, and she nodded emphatically, speaking a few more words in their language. Then, to Sam's amazement, the war chief drew his knife and stepped behind the tree. For a terrifying moment, Sam thought his life was over, but instead of slitting his throat, the chief cut the ropes that bound his wrists. Sam's arms fell to his sides, numb from hours of being tied behind the tree, and he had to lean against the trunk for support as feeling slowly returned to his hands. "You saved my daughter's life," the chief said, his tone still formal, but no longer hostile. "For this, I am in your debt. But there are those among my people who will not easily believe that a white man can act with honor. You must come with us, back to our village, and speak before the council of elders." Sam's heart sank. He had hoped that saving the chief's daughter would be enough to secure his freedom. The prospect of being taken to an Indian village, where he would be outnumbered by hundreds of warriors, was terrifying, but he could see that he had no choice in the matter. "What about my ranch?" he asked. "My cattle? If I leave now, I could lose everything I've worked for." The chief's expression softened slightly. Your animals will be cared for. I give you my word on this, but you must come with us. It is the only way to ensure that justice is done and that the truth is known among all our people. The journey to the village took 3 days, winding through country that Sam had never seen before, despite his years in the territory. The chief's daughter, whose name, he learned, was Star That Walks at Dawn, rode beside her father on a gentle mare, still weak from her injuries, but improving daily. Sam rode his own horse, surrounded by warriors who treated him with a mixture of respect and suspicion. On the first night, as they camped beside a clear mountain stream, Sam found himself wondering if he would ever see his ranch again. The warriors spoke little to him, but he could sense their watchfulness, the way their hands never strayed far from their weapons. He was not exactly a prisoner, but he was certainly not free to leave. It was Star That Walks at Dawn who finally broke through the barrier of language and mistrust. On the second evening, as Sam sat alone by the fire, she approached him, with careful steps, still favoring her injured side. You, she said in halting English, pointing to him. Then she touched her own chest. Star That Walks at Dawn. Sam looked up in surprise. He hadn't realized she could speak English, though he supposed it made sense. Many of the younger tribal members learned the language of the settlers, if only to better understand their enemies. Sam, he replied, touching his own chest. My name is Sam Mackenzie. She repeated his name carefully, her pronunciation careful and precise. Then she sat beside him, close enough to talk without being overheard by the other warriors. Why you help me? She asked, her English limited but understandable. Sam considered the question seriously. It was something he had been asking himself since the moment he first saw her lying wounded by the creek. Because it was right, he said finally. Because you needed help, and I was there to give it. She studied his face in the flickering firelight, as if trying to read something deeper in his expression. Many white men, they not help Indian woman. They maybe hurt her more. I'm not like those men, Sam said quietly. I judge people by their actions, not by the color of their skin or the language they speak. Star That Walks at Dawn nodded slowly. My father, he know this, but other people in village, they not trust easy. Too much bad things happen. Sam understood. He had heard the stories, settlers cheating traders, soldiers attacking peaceful camps, white men taking Indian women as unwilling wives. The history between their peoples was written in blood and betrayal, and it would take more than one act of kindness to change that. What will happen to me when we reach your village? He asked. She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Council will decide. If they believe you tell truth, you go free. If not. She didn't finish the sentence, but Sam could fill in the blanks. And what do you believe? Star That Walks at Dawn turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes serious and thoughtful. I believe you saved my life. I believe you good man, but my belief, it not enough. You must prove to others. The next morning brought them within sight of the village, and Sam's breath caught in his throat at the sight that greeted him. The settlement sprawled across a broad valley, with perhaps 50 lodges arranged in careful patterns around a central area. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played between the dwellings, and women worked at various tasks, while warriors moved through the camp with the casual alertness of men always ready for trouble. As their party approached, people began to emerge from their lodges to stare at the unusual sight of a white man riding among their warriors. Sam could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, could sense the mixture of curiosity and hostility in the crowd that began to gather. Chief Running Bear, for that was Star That Walks at Dawn's father's name, raised his hand for silence. Then he began to speak in his own language, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. Sam couldn't understand the words, but he could sense the drama of the moment, the way the people hung on their chief's every word. When Running Bear finished speaking, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then voices began to rise from the crowd. Some angry, some questioning, some filled with what sounded like disbelief. Sam saw men reaching for weapons, women pulling their children closer, elders shaking their heads in apparent dismay. But Star that walks at dawn rode forward then, her voice raised above the tumult as she addressed her people. Despite her obvious weakness from her recent injuries, her words carried power and conviction. She gestured toward Sam several times, and he realized she was telling them the story of how he had saved her life. Gradually, the angry voices died down, replaced by thoughtful murmurs and careful consideration. Sam could see the people looking at him with new eyes, evaluating him not just as an enemy white man, but as someone who had risked his own safety to help one of their own. Chief Running Bear called for silence once more. "The council will meet at sunset," he announced in English, presumably for Sam's benefit. "Until then, you will be guests in my lodge. But you will not be free to leave the village." Sam nodded his understanding. He was being given the honor of staying with the chief himself, which suggested a certain level of respect. But the warning about not leaving made it clear that he was still very much on trial for his life. The remainder of the day passed slowly. Sam was given food and water, and his wounds from the ropes were tended by the village medicine man. But he could feel the eyes of the people upon him wherever he went, could sense the underlying tension that pervaded the camp. Star that walks at dawn stayed close to him throughout the day, serving as both translator and protector. She introduced him to various people in the village, including her mother, White Dove Woman, who looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "She thanks you for saving me," Star that walks at dawn translated as her mother spoke rapidly in their native tongue. "But she fears what this will mean for our people. Already there are those who say harboring a white man will bring soldiers to our village." Sam understood the woman's fears. His presence here could indeed bring unwanted attention from the territorial authorities, especially if word got out that the tribe was holding a white rancher. But he also knew he had no control over that now. His fate was in the hands of people he barely understood, guided by customs and laws that were foreign to him. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the village drums began to beat. The deep rhythmic sound echoed off the surrounding hills, calling the people to gather for the council meeting that would decide Sam's fate. The council lodge was the largest structure in the village, capable of holding perhaps 100 people. Sam was escorted there by Chief Running Bear and several of his senior warriors, while Star that walks at dawn walked beside him, her presence a silent reminder of why he was there. Inside the lodge, the elders sat in a circle around a central fire, their faces grave and thoughtful in the flickering light. These were the stewards of the tribe's laws, men and women whose word carried the weight of generations. Their eyes, sharp and unyielding, followed Sam as he was brought to the center of the room. The air was heavy with the scent of burning sage, smoke curling upward toward the roof, twisting and coiling like the questions swirling in Sam's mind. He knelt slowly, as instructed by one of the warriors, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Star that walks at dawn stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, a gentle anchor in this strange, tense moment. Sam's pulse thudded in his ears, each beat echoing the uncertainty of his future. Every fiber of his being was alert, bracing for judgment. Chief Running Bear rose, towering over the seated elders, his presence commanding immediate attention. He gestured toward Sam, and then to his daughter, as if inviting her to speak first. Star that walks at dawn stepped forward, her voice calm but strong. "My father," she said in English, glancing at Sam before continuing in her native tongue, which the council understood clearly. "This man saved my life. He did not harm us. He could have left me to die, but he stayed. He cared. He healed." There was a murmur among the elders. Some nodded, others remained silent, their faces inscrutable. One elderly woman leaned forward, her hair streaked with silver, eyes like polished obsidian. She asked something in a low, measured tone, and Star that walks at dawn responded quickly, translating, "She asks if you acted alone, if any of your people were harmed by your hand." "I swear," Sam said, his voice firm, "I did not harm a single one of your people. When I arrived, they were already dead. I only tried to help your daughter. I did what I thought was right." The chief's eyes bore into him, studying every twitch, every hesitation. Finally, he spoke in English for Sam's benefit. "Your actions speak of honor. Yet the council must hear more, for not all will believe your word alone." He turned to the elders, resuming his native speech, gesturing for Sam to remain seated. One by one, the elders questioned him. They asked about the smoke he had seen, the path he took, the hours he spent with Star that Walks at Dawn, and the injuries she suffered. Sam answered each as truthfully and calmly as he could, aware that a single slip of tone or hesitation could seal his fate. Finally, an elder leaned forward, the light from the fire casting deep shadows across his lined face. "If he speaks truth, then the ones who killed our people ride still, and they are dangerous," he said. "How will he help us find them?" Sam's stomach tightened. He had no idea who the attackers were, only that they were armed, swift, and brutal. But he knew he could not show fear here. "I will help," he said slowly. "I know the territory. I know how to track men who want to hide. Give me a day, and I can find their trail." A younger warrior, barely 20, spoke up, his tone sharp with skepticism. "And if this is a lie? If he leads us into a trap?" The chief raised a hand to silence him, eyes sweeping across the lodge. "Then we watch him closely. But for now, the daughter he saved speaks for him. That is worth much in this council." He turned back to Sam. "You will remain under watch until dawn. Tomorrow, we will ride together, and you will show us the trail." Sam nodded. The relief that washed over him was tempered by the realization that his journey was far from over. The village, though protective of its own, was not blind to danger, and neither was he. As they escorted him back to a small lodge on the edge of the central circle, Star that Walks at Dawn walked beside him. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Council believes you," she said softly, "but you must show it. Trust is earned, not given." "I understand," Sam replied. "I'll do my best." The night was long and restless. Sam could hear the distant sounds of the village, the low murmur of voices, the occasional laughter of children, the sharp call of a hawk in the darkness. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat, every rustle of leaves a test of his nerves. But he was ready. Whatever came in the morning, he would face it. Dawn broke over the valley with a soft, muted glow. The mountains that cradled the village were bathed in pale light, and a thin layer of mist hovered above the grasslands. Sam rose before the others, stretching the stiffness from his arms and shoulders. The night had offered little sleep, but his resolve had grown stronger. Today he would prove his honesty and repay the village for their trust. He met Chief Running Bear and the warriors at the edge of the central circle. Star that Walks at Dawn appeared beside her father, mounted on a sturdy mare. Sam's own horse was ready, the leather saddle creaking as he swung into place. The chief addressed the warriors in his tongue, issuing clear orders, and then turned to Sam. "Show us where the killers fled," Running Bear said in English. "We follow your lead, but every step is watched." Sam nodded. "I will do my best." "I tracked them last night in the smoke near Willow Creek. They moved fast, but I believe I can find their trail again." The party set off, the villagers' horses moving with silent precision through the morning fog. Sam rode near the center, guiding them toward the northern ridges where the first signs of the attackers' passage had been observed. Broken branches, disturbed soil, and faint hoofprints marked their path. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the anticipation of proving his loyalty. Hours passed, the group riding in tense silence, each member alert to the slightest movement. Finally, Sam spotted the first clue, a torn fragment of cloth snagged on a thorn bush, dyed with the same blood that had marked the fallen victims. He pointed to it. and Star That Walks at Dawn translated for the chief and the council's scouts. "They went this way," she said. "You saw this, and it is true. You led us correctly." The chief's eyes narrowed as he examined the fragment. He nodded to one of his warriors, who spurred ahead to check the path. Soon, more evidence appeared. Bent reeds, deeper hoof prints, and the faint smell of smoke from a distant campfire. Sam's confidence grew, and so did the village's trust. With every step, he proved that he was not only truthful, but capable of helping them in matters that required skill, courage, and judgment. But the trail was not without danger. By midday, the party reached a narrow pass, where rocks jutted sharply, and the dense forest offered perfect concealment for ambush. Sam dismounted to inspect the ground more closely. "They know this terrain," he murmured. "They might try to hide. Wait for us to come close." Chief Running Bear studied him, then signaled a halt. "We take precautions. Scouts in front, flankers on the sides. No one moves recklessly." The warriors fanned out, the sound of hooves muffled by the soft earth. Sam led the party slowly through the pass, eyes scanning the shadows for the slightest sign of movement. Hours stretched into tension-filled silence until the faint glint of metal caught his eye. A rifle barrel, half hidden behind a fallen tree. "Stop!" he hissed. The warriors froze, their eyes following his gaze. "They are here!" A rustle in the underbrush answered him, and two men stepped into view, rifles raised. Sam recognized them from his earlier scouting. Hunters turned killers, opportunists who preyed on isolated ranchers and travelers alike. The battle was inevitable. The chief barked orders in his tongue, and Sam felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This was no longer a test of truth. It was a test of skill, courage, and survival. He checked his revolver, feeling the familiar leather grip, and prepared for what was to come. Beside him, Star That Walks at Dawn lifted her bow, arrows already nocked, her face set in determined defiance. The first shot rang out, shattering the tense morning air. Sam dropped instinctively behind the nearest ridge, heart hammering as the sharp report echoed across the valley. Dust and small stones kicked up where the bullet had struck, and he glimpsed the flicker of movement as one of the hidden figures ducked behind a boulder. Star That Walks at Dawn was already moving beside him, her eyes wide but resolute. "They are close," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of Sam's heart. She was still weak from her wounds, yet there was a fire in her gaze that made Sam realize she would not back down. Sam raised his rifle slowly, peering through the scope at the distant tree line where the attackers had appeared. There were at least 3 of them, riding fast and low, their faces covered with scarves and wide-brimmed hats. Their horses were lean and trained for speed, and each rider carried a repeating rifle, deadly enough to make any direct charge suicidal. He cursed under his breath. Whoever these men were, they had chosen their ambush well. "Stay low," he muttered, pressing his back to the ridge. "We'll have to draw them closer before we can move." Star That Walks at Dawn nodded, gripping the reins of her horse and keeping her movements smooth despite her injuries. Sam felt a pang of guilt. He had dragged her into danger once, but he could not abandon her now. Survival meant careful planning, patience, and trust in instincts honed over decades on the frontier. The attackers began advancing, kicking up a haze of dust in the morning sun. Sam fired a warning shot, the bullet whistling past one rider and thudding into the dirt near the horse's hooves. The rider reined in sharply, eyes scanning for the source of the shot. "They know we're here," Star That Walks at Dawn said, her voice tense but calm. "We cannot outrun them." Sam's mind raced. He considered their options: charge, retreat, or hold position. Charging would expose them to fire from above. Retreating could split them from the trail to the village. Holding meant drawing the attackers into a trap of his own making. He gestured toward a narrow ravine to their left. "There," he said. "We can use the ridge to funnel them. It's steep. Horses will struggle. We can take advantage of that." Star That Walks at Dawn followed his lead, riding cautiously alongside him. Together they edged toward the ravine, keeping low and silent, hearts pounding in synchrony. The attackers, seeing their prey seemingly cornered, pressed forward with reckless confidence. Sam readied his rifle, calculating the trajectory, the distance, and the timing. He had learned long ago that precision, not brute force, decided life or death in such moments. One misfire, one misstep, and both he and the chief's daughter could die before reaching the village. Or worse, their deaths could draw the attackers closer to innocent families. The first rider approached the ravine, his horse stumbling slightly on the uneven ground. Sam fired, the bullet striking true, throwing the rider from his mount. The second attacker reined in, momentarily distracted by his comrade's fall. It was all Sam needed. He and Star That Walks at Dawn lunged forward, using the ridge and the rough terrain to shield themselves, forcing the remaining attackers into a panicked retreat. Gunfire rang out again, echoing off the canyon walls. Sam's breathing was ragged, sweat running down his temples, but he could see the attackers faltering. Horses skidded in the loose gravel, and the attackers' confidence began to crumble. Star That Walks at Dawn fired a single shot, her aim unerring despite her weakened state. One of the remaining men yelped and fell back, clutching his arm. Sam realized then that the girl was far braver than her injuries suggested. Her determination burned brighter than any fear. By the time the attackers retreated into the tree line, the valley was silent once more, save for the distant whisper of the wind. Sam exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. That's done," he said, though even he knew the danger was far from over. Whoever had attacked them once could, and likely would, return. Star That Walks at Dawn slid from her horse, limping slightly but steady. "We survive," she said simply, the corner of her mouth lifting in a faint, grim smile. "We must follow them. They leave trail." Sam nodded. Despite the pounding of his heart and the soreness in his limbs, he knew she was right. They could not afford to let the killers escape. The blood of her family demanded justice, and the truth of that morning would not be buried. Together they followed the tracks into the dense forest beyond the valley, unaware of how treacherous the path would become, or of the deadly ambush that awaited them deeper in the shadows. The forest closed around them like a living wall, the sunlight barely piercing the dense canopy. Every step was a careful calculation, roots snaking across the dirt, slick patches of moss, and the faint, unsettling snap of twigs beneath their boots. Sam kept glancing back, half expecting the attackers to emerge from the shadows, but only the whispering wind answered. Star That Walks at Dawn moved cautiously, her hand brushing against the rough bark of trees for balance. "They know we follow," she said softly. "We must be ready for them." Sam nodded, his senses straining. The forest smelled of damp earth and pine, but beneath it there was another scent. Smoke, faint but unmistakable. He froze. "Someone's camped nearby," he whispered. "They didn't go far." They approached the source, careful to stay downwind, and came upon a small clearing. Smoke curled lazily from a fire pit, and the scent of cooking meat hung in the air. 3 men sat around the fire, laughing and tossing a knife back and forth. Their rifles rested against the nearest tree, almost within reach. Sam crouched behind a fallen log, scanning the clearing. "We can take them quietly," he murmured, "but one misstep, and it's over." Star That Walks at Dawn nodded. "I can distract them," she whispered. "You take the shot." Before Sam could protest, she stepped from the shadows, letting out a sharp cry that mimicked the wail of a trapped animal. The men jumped to their feet, rifles raised, scanning frantically. In that moment of chaos, Sam aimed carefully, exhaled, and fired. The first attacker dropped without a sound, the rifle slipping from his grasp. The other 2 scrambled, realizing too late that they had been ambushed. Sam's second shot struck the ground near the second man, sending dirt and gravel into his face. He stumbled back, tripping over a root, and Star That Walks at Dawn was already on him, her knife flashing in the dim light. The final attacker tried to flee, but Sam was faster. Another shot rang out, this one precise, and the man collapsed near the edge of the clearing. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the heavy breathing of the pair. Star that Walks at Dawn wiped her blade clean on her sleeve, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and triumph. We survived this," she said, her voice trembling. "But there will be more." Sam nodded, helping her up. He knew she was right. Whoever had sent these men would not rest until they had achieved their purpose. And now, the trail would lead them deeper into enemy territory. They moved cautiously, following the faint tracks left in the soft earth, until the forest began to thin, giving way to a rocky hillside. The wind carried a faint sound, voices, low and urgent. Sam pressed a hand to Star that Walks at Dawn's shoulder, signaling her to stay silent. Peering through the brush, they saw a small encampment nestled among the rocks. Horses were tethered nearby, and figures moved about, tending to supplies and weapons. It was clear now, this was no random attack. It was organized. They were walking into a nest of enemies. "We'll need a plan," Sam whispered, his mind racing. "We can't just charge in." Star that Walks at Dawn's gaze hardened. "We won't," she said. "We'll outsmart them." "That's how we survive." Sam exhaled slowly, the tension coiling in his chest. They had survived the ambush, but the real challenge was just beginning. Ahead, in the shadows of the rocks, lay the heart of their enemy's operation, and the truth behind the attack that had set this dangerous game in motion. Every step forward was a gamble, every sound a potential threat. But they pressed on, side by side, determined to see this through. Sam and Star that Walks at Dawn crept along the edge of the rocky hillside, every step deliberate. The enemy camp lay sprawled below them, a small cluster of tents and makeshift shelters with a few horses tethered nearby. The faint crackle of a fire mingled with murmured voices, carried up by the cool evening breeze. "They're fewer than I thought," Sam whispered, crouching behind a jagged boulder. "Maybe 6 or 7 at most." Star that Walks at Dawn scanned the camp carefully. "And all armed. Even a single misstep could alert them." Her voice was calm, but the tension in her eyes betrayed the fear beneath. Sam nodded. "We'll need to separate them. Divide and conquer." He picked up a small stone, testing the weight in his hand. With a flick of his wrist, he sent it rolling toward the opposite edge of the camp. It landed with a soft thud, followed by the snapping of a twig. One of the men cursed and stepped toward the noise, rifle in hand. The others followed instinctively, leaving the fire and supplies momentarily unattended. "That's our chance," Sam murmured. He and Star that Walks at Dawn descended swiftly, using the rocks and sparse vegetation for cover. They moved like shadows, silent and precise, until they were within striking distance. Star that Walks at Dawn acted first. With the skill of someone trained in survival and combat from childhood, she lunged at the nearest man, slamming him to the ground and disarming him. Sam moved simultaneously, his rifle trained on the others, forcing them to halt. A tense standoff ensued. One of the men tried to raise his rifle, but Sam's steady aim held him in check. "Down!" he barked, "or you don't get to see tomorrow." The camp fell silent, broken only by the labored breathing of those caught in the sudden trap. Star that Walks at Dawn had the first attacker restrained, holding him with the ease of a practiced fighter. Sam stepped forward, his eyes scanning the remaining men. "You came to hurt my people," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But we won't let you. Leave now and live. Stay and you'll regret it." For a moment it seemed as if they would fight to the last man. But then the 2 men holding rifles hesitated, the resolve in Sam and Star that Walks at Dawn clear and unwavering. Slowly the tension in their shoulders eased. "We go," one of them muttered, and with a final glare they fled into the approaching night, leaving their fallen companion behind. Sam exhaled sharply. "That's the last of them, for now." He turned to Star that Walks at Dawn. "We need to move quickly. They'll regroup and come back with reinforcements if we linger." Together, they searched the camp. Among the scattered belongings and discarded weapons, they found clues that explained the attacks. Maps, stolen supplies, and letters from a rival rancher who had been trying to drive Sam off his land for months. The violence had been orchestrated from jealousy and greed, not random malice. This was all about your ranch, Star That Walks at Dawn said quietly, her eyes scanning the documents. They wanted to scare you off. Take what was yours. Sam's jaw tightened. They'll pay for this. But first, we make sure no one else gets hurt. They burned the camp, ensuring that no trace remained that could be misused by the remaining outlaws. Then, guided by the last light of dusk, they made their way back to the village, carrying the captured man with them to face justice. When Chief Running Bear saw the survivor, his expression was one of grim satisfaction. "Justice," he said simply, nodding to Sam. "You have proven your honor and your courage." The council gathered once more, this time with a sense of closure rather than tension. Sam recounted the pursuit, the ambush, and the confrontation in careful detail, aided by Star That Walks at Dawn's translation. The elders listened, their faces grave, weighing every word. Finally, Chief Running Bear spoke. "You have saved my daughter. You have defended our people, and you have shown what is right in the face of violence and deceit. You are free to return to your ranch. And know this, you will always have friends here." Star That Walks at Dawn smiled faintly at Sam. "I told them you were good," she said softly. "I hope now they believe it." Sam nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "They do," he said, "because you told the truth, and I followed it." The next morning, Sam and Star That Walks at Dawn rode together out of the village, the first light of dawn casting long shadows over the valley. The forest and hills stretched endlessly before them, but now the path seemed less threatening. They had faced danger, survived betrayal, and emerged stronger for it. When Sam reached his ranch, he found it untouched. The cattle were safe, the fences intact, and Rosie waiting patiently. Relief washed over him like a cool river, and he dismounted, running his hands over the familiar wood of his cabin. That evening, Star That Walks at Dawn stayed with him for a short time, sharing stories of her people through gestures and broken English. There was no need for further words. The bond they had forged in fire and blood spoke more clearly than any language could. As the sun set behind the Wyoming horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson, Sam looked out over his land. He had survived ambush, violence, and doubt, but more importantly, he had done what was right. Justice had been served, trust had been earned, and in a world that often seemed dark and unforgiving, he had found a glimmer of hope. And as night fell, with the stars glimmering overhead, Sam knew that he was ready for whatever came next, because he had faced the worst, and he had emerged not just alive, but stronger, wiser, and more certain of the kind of man he wanted to be.